So today we're going to be looking at something from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in first edition, obviously, because that's what we're focusing on at the moment. I have been asked about to do some AD&D or previous versions and so on, D&D and even modern versions. Maybe down the line something, but there's a lot to still explore with the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So what I would like to look at today is something that's a little bit not normally in the wheelhouse of most characters. So or players, I should say, and we chalk this up to more of a case of what questions do we not normally ask. And in this instance, today we're talking about that other form of damage. And in fact, there's actually two other forms of damage, but it all sort of lumps in together. So we're looking at incidental and subdual damages. So before we get started, I just want to put a couple of points of housekeeping through. First of all, I want to thank everybody who submits questions or who provides comments and is on the website, YouTube, and it's involved in all that. That's fantastic. I love that. Thank you very much. So the next part is that to plug an amazing resource, which is the only magazine devoted to first edition AD&D and old school gaming, and of course I'm referring to Flipping and Turning. So Flipping and Turning is a magazine made by fans and is available for download for minimal dollar value. I think it's like a couple of bucks or something like that. And the Smoldering Dung Games will put the address around somewhere. And the final bit of housekeeping, I just want to thank my patrons for still supporting me, and it's been a while between drinks, but we're getting there. They sort of help with providing questions or submissions, as well as just, admittedly, a little bit of fundage helps sort of provide a bit of gap and space to be able to get aside and do these sorts of videos. Nearly everything is available. I don't really put things behind paywalls, but I just wanted to put an extra special thank you for people who are willing to put some skin in the game. Thanks very much, and I appreciate that. Okay, so now on to the topic. So the first mention of anything like this comes from our first core book, which is the Monster Manual. A book that we rarely get into and is probably worth exploring at some point. And if we turn to the section on dragons, we have How to Subdue a Dragon. So subduing a dragon requires attacking and causing damage, but it's a different type of damage. You're doing almost this subdual damage, which is what it's called, suspiciously enough, and non-fatal battering and bruising damage. The total number of hit points scored is considered a ratio versus its full hit points. And then you have a percentage of when the dragon finally gives up its freedom. After that, it's a matter of how long, depends on how well you treat it and so on. There are also certain types of creatures that can't engage in subdual damage, and also there are some creatures that you cannot subdue at all. Undead, demons, devils, they say specifically you cannot subdue them. The dragons and most other creatures you can, by the fact that it tells you whether you can't or not. So with dragons, which is our primary subdual according to this, they all come in various shapes and sizes, and it doesn't matter if they're good, bad, or indifferent. The players are able to go in, start smacking them around, and hope that they capitulate, which is interesting. So you can do it to other creatures, and a minotaur subdued is going to stick around and do things, but I'm just curious as to what a friendly minotaur would provide. I'm thinking like how a cat brings out that dead bird and puts it on your bed or on your doorstep. What does a minotaur bring? what would the Minotaur do to show, hey, I kind of like you? And you can do it with nearly everything, which is great, because sometimes you just want to have these sorts of things. So anyway, so dragons, creatures, beasties, they all can be subdued, and once they're subdued, they are under the control of the players to a point. Not so much that they become NPCs, but close enough. And if you have, for example, a 77 hit point dragon, and you inflict 22 points of damage on that, then it's as a ratio 22 over 77. That percentage is required every round for the dragon or the creature to capitulate. It's rather simple, but Subdual is one of those tools that can really sort of change the nature of the game a little bit for the players. Because if the players walk around going, well, we're going to start subduing creatures rather than killing them outright, you still get the experience points for everything else, but now you've got a creature that you can sell on the open market, as an example, as a pet, good luck, or just an exotic beastie for gladiator games elsewhere, just for a nice bit of coin. So the second and most common form of this other damage comes from the weaponless combat procedures, pummeling, grappling, and overbearing. With that, you have what's called incidental damage, and that is when you take 25% of that incidental damage, and it's real hit points, and then you have the remaining 75%, which is compared to your outstanding hit points, and if they match, you fall unconscious. So you do inflict 4 points of damage with a punch. 1 point is quote unquote real damage, and the 3 points is incidental. So with the incidental damage then, if the person has 10 hit points, the more incidental damage you do, you're keeping track of two different tallies. The points that come off from the real damage versus the incidental, and then once they meet, the person is unconscious. And if they go over, then if they go hit 0 and go over, then they, in effect, like they're down for one round for every point that it's beyond. So if you have 8 hit points remaining and someone does 10 points of pummeling damage to you, so that's 2 points of, maybe 3 points of real damage, and then the balance being the incidental damage, whatever's left over is how many rounds the person is unconscious for. So you'd be unconscious for quite a while. Of course, if you take a normal human being that's got 3 hit points and you pummel them with 12 points of punching damage, then they're likely to die from their wounds anyway. So this is not so much safe combat, but just safer combat. So between the two, being the subdual damage and the incidental damage, players have all these other options for combat, especially if they're running around with in a city or a town, and you don't really want them to be just killing everybody. You can just try to hope that the players say we're using subdual damage, or make an agreement that when you're in towns and cities, you're doing subdual unless you tell me that it's not, or you're using this incidental damage system instead. So there's a little bit here that the DM probably needs to get worked out a little bit, but it's just more of a case that the players should be thinking in terms of, well, what else can I do and where can I go with my character? That's where the direction I want to take them. You're not going to wanting them to just walk into a town and start killing people. I mean, obviously they can, and we know of stories where the players do, but for the most part, every time when they fight someone, is it a fight to the death? Should it be a fight to the death? And that's where these other systems of damage come into play. The one difference on all of the three main attacks, weaponless attacks, being the pummeling, grappling and overbearing, is the overbearing. The overbearing does half damage for its incidental, which is because you're knocking them to the ground. So when you think of the quarterback sack that happens, the ogre manages to tackle a magic user to the ground. That ogre is going to knock the magic user flat on their back and inflict copious amounts of damage, potentially any part of 6 to 10 damage, depending on how you want to do it. And that magic user has now taken 3 points of damage. If it's, like, say for instance 6, 3 points of damage and 3 points of incidental. They're knocked unconscious just from the wounds alone, but now they're also knocked out as such on top of that. Incidental damage comes back every round at 1 point per round. Subdual damage theoretically does not. So you're still attempting to do damage by normal means, but holding back is the theory with the subdual damage. So there's a slight difference, but if you want to make them the same, obviously that's a house rule, and if you want to make it easier for yourself, you can just point to the pummeling, grappling and overbearing rules with the incidental damage and invoke the Holy Trinity rule. That it's expanded a little bit better here. Perhaps this is the way that it's meant to be moving forward. But that's entirely up to the DM to decide. So one of the best places to go for, or one of the best events to happen for characters to explore subdual damage or the incidental damage and weaponless combat and non-lethal combat to that point is, of course, the Renaissance fairs and the tournaments, where the objective of the game isn't to kill your opponent, it's a competition of skill between the two. And you might have your knights lined up. You may even have a knight that decides to set up a pavilion on a bridge and wants to challenge everybody to crossing the bridge. And then you launch almost, not quite a mini game, but it's definitely an encounter with everything that's going on. There's so many fairs and festivals and saints' days or holy days and holiday days and reasons for the peasantry to just throw on a fair and so on. And you might have a small military unit nearby that like to play games and decide that they're just going to have competitions that are open to everybody or for everyone to come and watch. And the PCs will stumble across it all to be able to just get involved with a nice tournament style or a tournament, which can lend to some very interesting things. I mean, some of the coolest encounters come out of the weirdest and random places, and they might find a knight that helps them, or that they just like the cut of their jib. And it might be a good way for a PC to find a mentor that needs to find that 7th to 9th level fighter type for training, or for the players to find some henchmen or some hirelings. There's always someone looking for some work, blacksmiths available, and so on. So the DM just needs to work out and nut out a couple of points on how to make tournaments, fairs, duels and challenges a thing. Because if you challenge someone to a duel and they die in combat, they die in combat, but if it's intentionally to the death, is different to if they die accidentally because they were really a 3 hit point character and the player went out and bludgeoned them in some way. It's one of those, the DM really needs to just work out a couple of ways to make it happen. And tournaments are just fun. they're a fun scenario. You've got intrigue, you've got people who cheat, you've got performance enhancing. Is magic allowed? Is magic not allowed? You've someone who takes on that giant strength or the superheroism potion before jumping on the horse and challenging, and getting into a duel. Are they allowed? Do you have the magic, like the independent magic user casting detect magic on everybody and so on? So it's got a little ways and means of just being a little bit funky. We know that the tournament scene was very large and very popular with the crowd that couldn't participate, being the serfs and the peasants. It was a great way for them to have a few days off or a day off from their work, and it was good for the lords to be able to stretch their limbs out in a safe way without having to go into combat. Money changed hands everywhere. You had betting and gambling, and you had match fixing. Imagine like the soccer league or the football leagues and the fantasy football leagues all set up with knights and the PCs in there, and you'll have groups that will recognise the heraldry because they follow the tournament scene and so on. So that's a really fascinating way of introducing or getting the characters involved with some of that incidental or subdual damage or non-lethal damage, depending on how you want to run it. And it's just one of those really nice scenarios that just opens up a lot of role play, a lot of gameplay, and builds something for the characters to work with from there. And if you can get the players to want their characters to engage in the world, then as the DM, you're getting everyone to buy into it, which is great. And when you run timing and you know that, oh wow, spring's coming up, yep, so we're going to have the big, you put it up on the notice board, the fair at the harvest moon and so on and everything like that, and you've got gypsies and you've got all sorts of shady characters that just follow these things around, side hustles. It's just a great way for every character to get involved. You'll be able to get find a way for even the magic user to find something to do or to be interactive. They might act as the mouthpiece for the fighter, doing all of the heraldry and and so on. You've got the bards, which obviously can sing the praises, but it's all fun. We've all seen various movies where knights of renown get into tournaments and jousting matches for fun and play, as well as for honor and dueling. So not everything is always to the death, but it's just something that the players and the DM, I think, should think about before they get too involved. Before you start something like a city adventure, just explain to the players, look, maybe you should want to think about doing these sorts of things. Or a good way of introducing that type of damage is by saying, oh, well, look, these are tournament lancers. They're not normal lancers. They do 1/4 less damage, and you can get knocked off your horse like this. And then there are consequences. You want to join and get into the match, you could potentially lose your horse, you could potentially lose your the entry fee, or you may even gain another horse or gain some gold pieces along the way. And of course you'll have your thieves and assassins and bards and the less scrupulous folk maybe putting a little bit of money on the side for that side hustle. So we might as well just run with a small scenario for Subdual on just this sort of scale. So what we have are 3 characters. We've got our fighter, our elf fighter something, and our human magic user or spellcaster. We'll call it a magic user today. And there is our ogre. For whatever reason they choose to subdue the ogre, and we need to work it out just like a regular combat. So we'll assume no surprise. We've got all this sort of set up here. It's at the initial parts. The human fighter is carrying a bastard sword. The elf has got a long sword. And the magic user has the staff. So the ogre is purple and the players are the blue. Initiative to determine who goes first. Initiative was rolled and we have 4 for the players, 6 for the ogre. The ogre is going first. The ogre was in effect moving to the elf to engage within range and spec, and comes in a swinging. So to get some pre-work out of the way, what we know, the ogre is a large creature, which is going to be useful for the damage. To hit a base armor class 0 ding, armor class 5. I actually treat ogres as a base armor class of 7 for purposes of weapon adjustment and armor, generally relating to their gnarled hides and a little bit better than the leathers. It's a bit more tougher skin with bumps and lumps and so on. So you can do whatever you wish. Me, I call it a 7, much like studded leather armor, but their armor class is 5. 4 plus 1 hit dice. 1 attack. And D10. We'll just run with D10. No special weapon today. But for the pre-work, we just need to know that. We need to know what we're doing with this. And of course have the hit points calculated. The ogre attacking the elf. The elf has an armor class of 3 with some base armor class of 5. And we're off to the races. Also part of the pre-work, today I'm using a what you see is what you get sort of approach, and the weapon is a hammer which has a 0 modifier against AC 5. For completeness, the ogre has 16, 17, 18 hit points in total, being a 4 plus 1 hit dice creature. It's just worth having obviously beforehand. And now we can do the ogre's attack. The ogre needing 12 or higher and missing. The characters engaged. The magic user had chosen to not do anything but move for this one, because any spells cast don't count as a subdual. Web might be useful. The ogre obviously sleep. It won't help because the ogre can't be asleep when it's subdued. And magic missile and so on reduce the hit points, but if you end up doing damage in the wrong way, you could kill what you're after rather than subduing it. I am going to be running the subdual rules with the 1/4 real damage, which is one of something that the DM needs to have sorted out as to how they're going to do it. But once you've made up your mind, you just stick with it. So it's not like it's something that you have to try. You just go this way or that way with the subdual damage. So now it's time for the characters to attack. So the elf, being 2nd level, needs to roll 14 or higher, with no adjustment for AC because the weapon doesn't provide one, and doesn't hit. The fighter with the bastard sword does gain an adjustment of +1, the top, the strength, is also a level and misses. Actions declared, continuation of the combat, purple being the ogre. This time simultaneous, and it's on for young and old. Being simultaneous, we're going in speed factor, so I've given the ogre a speed factor of a morning star with this instance, so that brings it to a speed factor of 7. The fighter with the bastard sword has a speed factor 6, and the elf has a speed factor of 5. So the order of combat is of course elf, bastard sword, and then the ogre. So the elf hits. Doing 8 subdual damage. So what I'm going to do is just represent it like this. So the 2 points of damage, that's real, and the remaining 6 become subdual, and that's what the ogre has left over. 16 points, 6, and then we work out some ratios at the end of this round. But we'll keep the combat going for the moment, obviously. Human fighter. Hitting. Bastard sword damage versus large. 6. As our representation goes, that's how much subdual damage versus the total of hit points. Now the ogre gets to have his attack. And misses. The 10 hit points of subdual, or 10 subdual damage divided by the 14 for the total hit points remaining, equals 0.71, or 71% chance of a subdual at the end of this round. So the question is, will the ogre submit? Yes, 10, well under the 71. The ogre capitulates and submits, cowers, cries quarter, and the players have captured the ogre. So it does lend itself to the question of what happens if the players decide to try and subdue everything. Well, they've still got to capture it, hold it, and look after it, etc. So in this instance, they needed to subdue the ogre, and they did so. They captured the ogre is submitting and doesn't want to be hurt anymore, and is willing to accept that the characters are the new boss. Depending on how well they treat the ogre in the short term, depends on how much they want the ogre will try and escape or overturn and so on. And as it's quite low intelligence, if they treat it well, it may actually prefer to stay in with the party and just become part of the pack. You just don't know what the DM does from here. In part, it is up to the way that you want to play it, but this is great for when they're in the cities or when they're in towns, and they just don't want to walk around killing everybody. So hopefully I've cleared up a few pieces. It's not that difficult, it's really quite simple. It's in terms of the mechanics, it's probably one of the most simplest mechanics that's in the game, and it's really more surprising that players don't take it up as an option more often. So anyway, alright, well thank you very much for sticking with us today. These are my character sheets, and we'll be catching up soon. Play safe.